March 18th, 1945. 0547 hours. Somewhere over the Rhine River, flying at 12,000 feet through pre-dawn darkness, Captain James Mitchell of the 416th Bomb Group checked his instruments for the 100th time. The twin Pratt and Whitney engines of his A-26 Invader hummed with mechanical precision, a sound he had learned to trust more than his own heartbeat during 47 previous missions over occupied Europe. Behind him, stretched across 3 miles of German sky, flew 17 more Invaders, each loaded with 4,000 pounds of high-explosive ordnance. Their target was a place most Americans had never heard of and never would, a railway marshalling yard designated on intelligence maps simply as Objective Baker 7, located outside the small German town of Bebra in central Germany. What Mitchell and his squadron didn't know as they droned eastward through the darkness was that they were about to execute one of the most devastating single-squadron attacks of the entire war, transforming a critical logistics hub into a burning monument to Allied air superiority and effectively severing one of the last major supply arteries feeding German forces defending the collapsing Reich. The mission had begun 9 hours earlier in a cramped briefing room at Station 164 near Laon, France. Major Robert Basler, the squadron commander, had pulled back the curtain covering the wall map to reveal a red line stretching deep into Germany, deeper than most crews had flown since the Allied advance had overrun forward bases in France. The target, Bebra Railway Junction, was identified by intelligence as a critical node in the German transportation network. 3 main rail lines converged there, connecting the industrial Ruhr region with forces fighting in central Germany and the rapidly approaching Eastern Front. More importantly, recent reconnaissance photos had revealed something extraordinary. The marshalling yard was packed beyond capacity with rolling stock, hundreds of railway cars, dozens of locomotives, and what appeared to be massive stockpiles of supplies waiting for distribution. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Ardery, the group intelligence officer, had explained the strategic situation with unusual gravity. "Gentlemen, Germany is dying, but it's not dead yet. They're attempting to consolidate their remaining resources, pulling back what they can salvage from the west to make a stand somewhere further east. Bebra is one of the last functioning marshalling yards with the capacity to handle this kind of volume. Our reconnaissance from March 16th shows approximately 200 freight cars, 30 locomotives, multiple storage buildings, and what our analysts believe are substantial ammunition and fuel stockpiles. The rail infrastructure includes repair facilities, a roundhouse, coaling towers, and extensive track networks. Your job is to destroy it completely, not damage it, destroy it. We want this facility removed from the German order of battle permanently." The briefing room had fallen silent as crews absorbed the magnitude of the assignment. This wasn't another bridge or another supply dump. This was a target that represented the arterial system of German logistics, a facility that had been operating continuously since before the First World War and had grown into one of the most sophisticated railway complexes in Central Europe. The reconnaissance photos were passed from crew to crew, each pilot and bombardier studying the layout, memorizing the distinctive features that would help with target identification. The storage buildings were massive structures, each one capable of holding enough supplies to sustain an entire division for weeks. The locomotive roundhouse, clearly visible in the photos, was an engineering marvel, a circular building with tracks radiating outward like spokes on a wheel, allowing locomotives to be serviced, repaired, and turned without the need for extensive maneuvering. The coaling towers, tall structures that dominated the yard's skyline, were critical infrastructure for steam locomotives, allowing rapid refueling of the engines that pulled Germany's military trains. The crews had studied the reconnaissance photos in silence. Even to untrained eyes, the target was extraordinary. The marshalling yard sprawled across nearly 2 square miles, a maze of parallel tracks filled with static trains. The locomotive roundhouse was clearly visible, a distinctive circular building designed to service and turn engines. Multiple storage structures lined the tracks, their long roofs unmistakable in the aerial imagery. What made the target both attractive and dangerous was its location. Bebra sat in a river valley, surrounded by hills that could hide anti-aircraft positions. The town itself was small, maybe 5,000 inhabitants, but the railway facility was the economic heart of the region, employing hundreds of workers and serving as a critical waypoint for military traffic. German defences would be significant, and the intelligence estimate predicted at least 12 heavy flak guns and numerous automatic weapons positioned on the surrounding hills with clear fields of fire over the entire valley. The attack plan was straightforward, but required precise execution. The 18 A-26 would approach at medium altitude, 12,000 feet, high enough to provide some protection from light flak but low enough for accurate bombing. The invaders would attack in 3 flights of 6 aircraft each, with 30-second intervals between flights. Each aircraft carried 40 100-pound general-purpose bombs, a mix of instantaneous and delayed action fuses designed to create maximum destruction and prevent firefighting efforts. The instantaneous fuses would detonate on contact, creating immediate destruction and shock waves that would damage nearby structures. The delayed action bombs, set to detonate anywhere from 30 minutes to 12 hours after impact, would terrorize rescue workers, prevent salvage operations, and ensure that fires had time to spread unchecked. The total bomb load for the squadron was 72,000 pounds of high explosive, equivalent to a small ammunition ship. Captain Mitchell, flying in the lead position of the first flight, would be responsible for marking the target. His bombardier, Lieutenant Thomas Webber, was considered the best in the squadron, having achieved an average circular error of less than 200 feet over his previous 30 missions. Webber had studied engineering at MIT before the war and understood ballistics with mathematical precision. He could calculate wind drift in his head, adjust for altitude variations instinctively, and had an almost supernatural ability to judge the exact moment of bomb release. If Webber could put his bombs on target, the following aircraft would have a clear aiming point, and the subsequent bombardiers could adjust their aim based on where Mitchell's bombs struck. The backup plan, if weather obscured the target, was to abort and return to base. High Command had made clear that this was a precision attack on a military objective, and collateral damage to the town was to be minimized if possible. This distinction between military and civilian targets had become increasingly important as Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany and began considering the post-war occupation. Destroying infrastructure needed for military operations was acceptable. Deliberately targeting civilian populations was not. The line between these categories was often blurry, but orders were clear. Attack military targets with precision, minimize unnecessary destruction. Captain William Hobart, piloting the second aircraft, had raised the obvious question during the briefing. What about fighters? The Luftwaffe was supposedly finished, its fuel exhausted, its pilots dead or captured, its airfields overrun. But supposedly didn't mean certainly, and every crew had heard stories about sudden encounters with the few remaining German fighters, often flown by desperate veterans with nothing to lose. Major Basler's response had been honest, but not particularly reassuring. Intelligence says the nearest operational Luftwaffe base is 80 miles away, with maybe a dozen serviceable aircraft and fuel for perhaps one sortie. We'll have P-47 top cover for the first half of the mission, and again on the way home. Over the target, you're on your own. The A-26 can outrun most German fighters, and the tailgunner position gives you defensive firepower if needed. Stay in formation, watch each other's backs, and get in and out fast. The weather forecast was favourable. Clear skies over the target with unlimited visibility and light winds from the west. Temperature at bombing altitude would be minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to require heated flight suits but not cold enough to cause serious equipment problems. Sunrise would occur at 6 months to 18 hours, meaning the attack would happen in full daylight with excellent visibility for the bombardiers, but also excellent visibility for German gunners tracking the formation. It was a calculated risk, trading vulnerability for accuracy. The Douglas A-26 Invader was perhaps the most advanced light bomber to see combat in World War II, a testament to American aeronautical engineering and a dramatic improvement over the medium bombers that had preceded it. First flown in July 1942, the A-26 combined speed, firepower and bomb load in a package that German intelligence had struggled to classify. Was it a fighter? A bomber? The answer was both and neither. With a top speed of 355 miles per hour, it was faster than many fighters. With a bomb load capacity of 4,000 pounds, it matched medium bombers twice its size. With up to 14 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns in some configurations, it possessed firepower that could shred ground targets or destroy enemy aircraft. The aircraft represented a philosophy of design that was distinctly American, brute force engineering backed by powerful engines and overwhelming firepower. Where European designers pursued elegance and efficiency, American engineers added more power, more guns, more payload capacity. The result was an aircraft that didn't turn as tightly as a fighter or carry as much as a heavy bomber, but could do both jobs adequately while being fast enough to escape trouble and tough enough to survive damage that would destroy more delicate designs. The Squadron's A-26Bs were configured for precision bombing, with a glazed nose section housing the bombardier position and forward-firing guns reduced to allow for the bombing equipment. But even in this configuration, each aircraft retained 6 50 caliber guns in 3 positions, enough firepower to make any attacker think twice. The nose position held 2 guns controlled by the bombardier, useful for strafing targets of opportunity. The dorsal turret held 2 more guns controlled by the engineer who also served as gunner, providing defensive fire against attacks from above. The tail position held 2 guns controlled by a dedicated gunner, covering the rear approach where most enemy fighters attacked. The engines, 2 Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasps producing 2,000 horsepower each, the same engine that powered the P-47 Thunderbolt, gave the Invader a power-to-weight ratio that allowed it to climb rapidly and maneuver like a much smaller aircraft. These engines were masterpieces of mechanical engineering, 18-cylinder radials with 2 banks of 9 cylinders arranged in a circular pattern. Each engine weighed 2,300 pounds but produced enough power to drive the aircraft at speeds that rivaled single-engine fighters. The engines were also remarkably reliable, capable of running for hundreds of hours between overhauls and able to sustain significant battle damage while continuing to function. Pilots told stories of returning to base on one engine, the other shot to pieces, but the remaining power plant pulling the aircraft home without complaint. As Mitchell's formation crossed into German airspace just after 6 a.m., the sky ahead began to lighten with the approaching dawn. Below, the landscape was a patchwork of forests and fields still brown from winter, cut by roads and rivers reflecting the growing light. Occasional towns appeared as darker clusters, most showing no signs of life at this early hour. The war had ground Germany down to survival mode, with civilians huddling in their homes hoping to endure one more day. The country below was dying, its cities bombed into rubble, its industry starved of raw materials, its population exhausted by years of total war. From 12,000 feet, the devastation wasn't immediately visible. The forests still looked green, the fields still stretched to horizons, the rivers still flowed. But the crews knew what reconnaissance photos revealed. Every major city was damaged, every industrial centre was targeted, every transportation hub was marked for destruction. Germany in March 1945 was a nation fighting on momentum and desperation, its military still capable of fierce resistance, but its defeat inevitable and approaching rapidly. Mitchell's co-pilot, Lieutenant George Patterson, a 22-year-old from Minnesota flying his 9th mission, scanned the horizon continuously for enemy fighters. The radio remained silent except for occasional position checks as the formation droned deeper into enemy territory. Every man aboard the 18 bombers understood that they were flying through a dying regime's last desperate attempts at defense, which made it potentially more dangerous, not less. A dying animal, as their briefing officer had reminded them, often fights most ferociously in its final moments. Patterson had joined the crew just 3 weeks earlier, replacing a co-pilot who had completed his tour and rotated home. He was still learning the rhythms of combat flying, still adjusting to the strange combination of boredom and terror that characterized bomber missions. Hours of routine flying punctuated by minutes of intense action, when flak filled the sky and every second felt like an eternity. He gripped the control column lightly, feeling the aircraft's responses, ready to take over if Mitchell was incapacitated. At 6:23 hours, the navigator, Lieutenant Charles Morrison, announced they were 15 minutes from the initial point, the geographical reference from which the bomb run would begin. Mitchell ordered the formation to climb to bombing altitude and tighten up. The 6 aircraft of the first flight closed intervals until they were flying in a tight box formation, each aircraft positioned to provide mutual support and ensure bomb pattern density. The bomber stream needed to be compressed spatially, so that all bombs would fall within a concentrated area, creating overlapping blast effects and ensuring nothing within the target zone survived. Behind them, the second and third flights followed suit, the entire squadron now flying as a coordinated unit, 18 aircraft moving through the sky with mechanical precision. Lieutenant Weber, the bombardier, had taken his position in the nose, adjusting his Norden bomb sight and checking wind calculations one final time. The Norden was a marvel of mechanical computing, a device that could calculate the complex ballistics required for accurate bombing by factoring in altitude, airspeed, wind, and target motion. In skilled hands, the Norden could put bombs within 100 feet of an aiming point from 4 miles up. At 12,000 feet with a stationary target, Weber expected to achieve even better accuracy. The device used a complex system of gears, gyroscopes, and mirrors to track the target and compute the exact moment of bomb release. Once the bombardier identified the target and centered it in the crosshairs, the Norden would track it automatically, compensating for aircraft motion and wind drift, calculating in real time the precise instant when released bombs would follow a ballistic trajectory to impact the target. At 634 hours, Morrison announced, "Initial point." The formation swung onto its bombing heading, and Mitchell engaged the autopilot, surrendering control of the aircraft to the bomb site's directional system. From this point until bombs away, Weber would fly the airplane through subtle inputs to the bomb site, keeping the crosshairs centered on the target. Mitchell's job was to maintain altitude and airspeed while watching for threats. His hands remained on the controls, ready to take over in an emergency, but for now he was a passenger in his own aircraft while the bombardier guided them toward the target. The first indication that German defences were alert came at 6:36 when black puffs of smoke began appearing in the sky ahead, heavy flak from 88mm guns opening fire. The gunners were good, ranging the formation quickly and adjusting their fire. The distinctive black bursts, each one a sphere of shrapnel expanding at supersonic velocity, began appearing at the formation's altitude. Shrapnel rattled against the invader's aluminum skin, a sound like hail on a tin roof, but with the knowledge that each piece of metal was travelling fast enough to punch through the aircraft's structure. Mitchell felt the familiar tightening in his gut, the knowledge that each black burst could be the one with your name on it. The mathematics of flak were coldly impersonal. Each 88mm shell contained a pound of high explosive surrounded by a steel casing that fragmented into hundreds of pieces. The fuse was set to detonate at a specific altitude based on optical rangefinders tracking the formation. If the gunners calculated correctly, the shell would explode within lethal range of the aircraft, sending shrapnel in all directions. A single fragment through the wrong component could bring down an aircraft. A hit in the fuel tanks could cause an explosion. A hit in the cockpit could kill the pilots. There was no skill involved in surviving flak, only luck. Behind him in the radio operator position, Sergeant Michael Torres called out flak positions, counting at least 8 guns in action, and watching for muzzle flashes that would indicate additional batteries opening fire. Torres was on his 41st mission, a veteran who had learned to read the patterns of anti-aircraft fire and predict where the next burst would appear. One aircraft in the second flight reported light damage but remained in formation, a few holes in the wing but nothing critical. The Germans knew something was coming and had prepared a reception. At 6:38 hours, Weber announced target in sight. Through the nose glazing, Mitchell could see Bebra spread across the valley below, and even from 2 miles up, the marshalling yard was unmistakable. The morning sun, now fully above the horizon, illuminated hundreds of railway cars arranged in long parallel rows, the roundhouse with its distinctive fan of tracks, storage buildings, and the complex network of rails converging from 3 directions. It was exactly as the reconnaissance photos had shown, a target-rich environment packed with German logistics infrastructure. The clarity of the view was remarkable. Every detail visible in the reconnaissance photos was now visible to the naked eye. Individual freight cars could be distinguished. Locomotives were parked in neat rows. The storage buildings cast long shadows in the early morning light. Weber could see workers moving around the yard, tiny figures going about their morning routines, unaware that death was falling toward them from 2 miles above. Weber made minute adjustments to the bomb site, centering the crosshairs on the roundhouse, selected as the optimal aiming point to ensure the bomb pattern would cover the maximum number of tracks and rolling stock. His hands moved with practiced precision, tiny movements that translated into course corrections for the entire aircraft. The crosshairs drifted across the target, and Weber compensated, bringing them back to center. The bomb site was doing its calculations, gears spinning, gyroscopes maintaining stable references, the release mechanism waiting for the exact instant when ballistics and geometry aligned. The flak intensified, the German gunners having found their range. The formation flew through a gauntlet of black explosions, each one sending shrapnel fragments whistling through the air. The sound inside the aircraft became a continuous rattle as metal struck metal, like flying through a hailstorm, but with each impact potentially fatal. Mitchell forced himself to maintain steady altitude and airspeed, trusting the bombardier to complete his work. Any deviation now would throw off the calculations and waste the mission. In the tailgun position, Sergeant James MacDonald watched for fighters, but saw only flak, an entire sky filled with exploding shells. MacDonald had been a gunner on B-17s earlier in the war and had transferred to A-26, seeking faster aircraft and smaller crews. He had seen aircraft blow apart when flak found their bomb bays, seen wings shear off when critical structures were hit, seen crews die in seconds when shells exploded in cockpits. He tracked the sky methodically, scanning sectors, looking for the glint of sunlight on canopies that would indicate enemy fighters diving to attack. At 6:39 hours, Weber pressed the bomb release. 40 100-pound bombs tumbled from the invader's bomb bay, falling away in a carefully calculated pattern. The bombs separated from the aircraft cleanly, their fins deploying to stabilize their fall and ensure they impacted nose first for maximum penetration and blast effect. The aircraft lurched upward, suddenly 2 tons lighter, and Mitchell immediately began a shallow turn to clear the target area, disengaging the autopilot and taking back control. Behind him, at precise 10-second intervals, the other 5 aircraft of the first flight released their bombs. 240 bombs, 24,000 pounds of high explosive, fell toward the marshalling yard in a deadly rain. The pattern was carefully designed to saturate the target area. Each aircraft's bombs would land in a slightly different location, but the overall pattern would cover the entire marshalling yard with overlapping blast effects. The flight time from release to impact was approximately 20 seconds. 20 seconds during which the bombs fell through 12,000 feet of air, accelerating under gravity, stabilizing under their fins, following ballistic trajectories calculated by the Norden bomb sight. Weber, watching through the bomb sight, saw his bomb strike first. The explosions walked across the marshalling yard in a perfect line, each bomb detonating with a bright flash and expanding fireball. The first bombs hit directly among a cluster of freight cars near the roundhouse. The cars disintegrated, their contents adding to the destruction. Individual freight cars weighing 30 tons were lifted bodily into the air, somersaulted, and crashed back to earth as twisted wreckage. Then Weber saw something he hadn't expected. One of his bombs, probably the 8th or 9th in the stick, hit something that produced a massive secondary explosion, a fireball that rose hundreds of feet and expanded outward in a rolling wave of destruction. The blast was so large that Weber instinctively pulled back from the bomb site, even though he was 2 miles away and separated from the explosion by the aircraft's structure. "Ammunition," he breathed into the intercom. "We hit an ammunition train. The secondary explosion was catastrophic, beyond anything the crews had witnessed in previous missions. The freight car, loaded with artillery shells or bombs or both, detonated with such force that it triggered sympathetic detonations in adjacent cars." A chain reaction rippled through the marshalling yard as one explosion touched off another and another. The blast wave expanded outward at supersonic velocity, shattering windows in the town, collapsing wooden structures, and creating an overpressure that ruptured eardrums and crushed lungs of anyone caught in the open within 500 yards. Freight cars were lifted bodily into the air, somersaulting hundreds of feet before crashing back to earth as unrecognizable wreckage. Railway tracks, each rail weighing hundreds of pounds per yard and bolted to heavy wooden ties embedded in gravel, were torn from their beds and twisted into abstract sculptures. The roundhouse, a solid brick structure that had stood for decades, collapsed as the shock wave struck it, the walls falling inward and the roof pancaking down on the locomotives being serviced inside. Within seconds, a quarter of the marshalling yard had ceased to exist, replaced by a roiling mass of fire and smoke and flying debris. The second flight's bombs arrived while this destruction was still unfolding, falling into chaos and adding to the catastrophe. Their 240 bombs fell into a target already transformed from an organized facility into a vision of hell. More freight cars exploded, more secondary detonations erupted, and the smoke column rising from the yard grew to a towering pillar, visible for 30 miles. Captain Hobart, leading the second flight, couldn't believe what he was seeing through his windscreen. The target was destroying itself, each explosion triggering others in an accelerating cascade of destruction. His bombs added to the inferno, walking through areas not yet touched by the first flight's bombs. The locomotive maintenance facilities, the coaling towers, the storage buildings, all vanished in sequential explosions. Individual structures that had taken months to build disappeared in seconds, transformed from solid engineering into rubble and flames. The third flight, led by Captain Andrew Morrison, approached a target barely visible through smoke and flames. Morrison made the decision to aim for the eastern end of the marshalling yard, where reconnaissance had shown additional rolling stock that might have escaped the first two flights. His bombardier, fighting to find an aiming point through the obscuration, finally identified a cluster of intact freight cars and centered his crosshairs. The smoke made precision difficult, but the bombardier had trained for this, understanding that even approximate aim into the target area would contribute to the overall destruction. The third flight's 240 bombs completed the destruction, the final hammer blows on a target already shattered. The eastern tracks disappeared under a carpet of explosions, every freight car in that section destroyed or damaged beyond repair. A fuel storage tank, previously hidden among other structures, erupted in a massive fireball that sent burning fuel cascading across the yard, igniting everything it touched. The fuel, probably diesel for locomotives or gasoline for military vehicles, burned with intense heat, creating fires that would consume everything flammable and melt metal structures into twisted wreckage. From his position, now circling away from the target, Mitchell watched the destruction with a mixture of professional satisfaction and pure awe. The entire marshalling yard was burning, consumed by fires that would burn for days. The smoke column had reached what he estimated as 15,000 feet, a black pillar reaching into the stratosphere, a beacon visible across half of central Germany. Fires burned across the entire facility, and explosions continued as delayed action bombs detonated and more ammunition stores cooked off in the heat. The mission had taken less than 3 minutes from first bomb to last, 3 minutes to erase decades of construction and months of supply accumulation. But those 3 minutes had erased a facility that had taken years to build and represented a critical node in German logistics that could not be replaced. As the formation turned westward toward home, their bomb bays empty and flak falling behind them, the radio operator in Mitchell's aircraft picked up German emergency transmissions. Though he spoke limited German, the panic in the voices needed no translation. Bebra was screaming for help, for fire brigades, for medical assistance, for any aid that could be provided. The transmissions grew more desperate as the scale of the catastrophe became apparent, but there was no help to give. The German emergency services, stretched beyond breaking across a collapsing Reich, had nothing to send. Fire brigades from surrounding towns had been destroyed in previous raids or lacked fuel for their vehicles. Medical facilities were overwhelmed with civilian casualties from weeks of bombing. The railway workers, the soldiers manning the flak guns, the townspeople living adjacent to the yard, they were on their own. The flight back to base was uneventful, almost anticlimactic after the intensity of the target run. The P-47s that had escorted them to the German border were waiting and fell in alongside the formation, their distinctive shapes reassuring in the morning sky. Not a single German fighter had appeared during the entire mission. The Luftwaffe, for all practical purposes, no longer existed as an effective force. Its airfields were cratered, its fuel depots empty, its pilots dead or grounded, its aircraft destroyed on the ground or captured in hangars. At 8:47 hours, the formation landed at Station 164, every aircraft returning safely despite the heavy flak over the target. Several bore damage, holes in wings and fuselages where shrapnel had penetrated, but the rugged construction of the A-26 had protected the crews from serious harm. Mitchell's aircraft had 14 holes from shrapnel, none in critical areas. One aircraft had a hole through the vertical stabilizer large enough to put a fist through, but the damage hadn't affected handling. The mission debriefing began immediately, crews filing into the operations room for interrogation by intelligence officers who recorded every detail. Intelligence officers listened as crew after crew described the destruction, the secondary explosions, the ammunition fires that had turned the target into an inferno. Each crew was questioned separately to get independent accounts and verify details. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Massive secondary explosions, complete destruction of the target area, fires burning out of control. Gun camera footage was rushed to processing, and within hours reconnaissance aircraft were dispatched to photograph the results. The photos would provide confirmation of the attack's success and guide assessment of whether follow-up attacks were necessary. What they found exceeded all expectations, surpassing even the optimistic predictions of the intelligence officers who had planned the mission. The reconnaissance photos taken that afternoon showed a scene of utter devastation that shocked even experienced photo interpreters who had seen hundreds of strike photos. The marshalling yard had essentially ceased to exist as a functional facility. Of the approximately 200 freight cars visible in the pre-strike photos, fewer than a dozen remained intact, and even those were damaged and likely inoperable. The rest were destroyed, burned out hulks scattered across the yard or simply gone, vaporized in the explosions. Of the 30 locomotives, only 3 appeared even potentially repairable, and 2 of those were lying on their sides, derailed by blast effects. The roundhouse was a collapsed ruin, its distinctive circular shape now just a ring of rubble. The maintenance facilities were flattened, their roofs collapsed and walls blown down. The tracks, where they were still visible through debris and wreckage, were twisted and unusable, torn from their beds and bent into shapes that defied their original purpose. Most significantly, the ammunition and fuel that had been stored in the yard had created an inferno that burned for 3 days, preventing any salvage or repair efforts and ensuring that even structures that survived the initial bombing were consumed by subsequent fires. German emergency reports, captured later in the war when Allied forces overran German command facilities, revealed the full extent of the catastrophe from the German perspective. The attack had destroyed the equivalent of an entire month of supply accumulation, supplies that had been laboriously gathered from across Germany and concentrated at Bebra for distribution to frontline units. Munitions meant for units fighting the Americans to the west and the Soviets to the east simply no longer existed, consumed in fires or scattered as fragments across the valley. Fuel that could have kept German tanks moving for another week had burned in spectacular fires that illuminated the night sky. Food that could have sustained troops and civilians had been carbonized. Medical supplies had been destroyed. Replacement parts for vehicles and weapons were gone. The economic impact on the surrounding region was immediate and severe, transforming Bebra from a prosperous railway town into an economic disaster area overnight. The human cost was equally significant, and perhaps more immediate in its impact on the surrounding community. The attack had caught the marshalling yard during shift change, with both night and day crews present in the facility. The night shift, which had been working since midnight, was preparing to leave while the day shift was arriving to take over operations. This meant maximum personnel density at the moment of attack. The flak gunners, required to remain at their posts during the attack and manning exposed positions on the surrounding hills, had no chance when the ammunition trains exploded. The blast waves reached their positions, and shrapnel from the secondary explosions scythed through their gun emplacements. German records listed 127 railway workers killed, men who were technically civilians even though they worked for the military railway system. 84 soldiers dead, primarily flak gunners and railway security personnel. Over 300 wounded, many critically with burns and blast injuries that would kill them in the following days or leave them permanently disabled. For a small town like Bebra, this represented a devastating loss, a catastrophe that touched virtually every family. Nearly every family had someone working in the railway facility, and the attack orphaned children and widowed families throughout the region. The wounded overwhelmed local medical facilities, and many died for lack of treatment. But the strategic impact went far beyond one town's tragedy and one day's casualty list. Bebra had been a critical node in a logistics network already stretched to breaking, and its destruction forced immediate and painful adjustments throughout the German military transportation system. Its destruction forced German military traffic to divert to alternate routes, adding days to transportation times and consuming precious fuel that Germany could not spare. Units waiting for supplies waited longer, their combat effectiveness degrading with each passing day. Ammunition didn't arrive when needed, forcing units to ration fire and reduce combat operations. Replacement equipment remained stuck in depots, unable to reach units that desperately needed it. The cumulative effect was to accelerate the collapse of German defensive capabilities at a moment when every hour mattered, and when German forces were already losing ground on multiple fronts. The attack also had psychological impact that intelligence analysts hadn't anticipated, but which would prove significant in the war's final weeks. German morale, both military and civilian, was already devastated by years of losing war and increasing Allied bombing. Cities were in ruins, industry was paralysed, and everyone knew defeat was approaching. But there was a qualitative difference between the massive raids by hundreds of heavy bombers, which seemed like impersonal forces of nature, and what happened at Bebra. A single squadron, just 18 aircraft, had destroyed an entire major facility in minutes. The efficiency was terrifying, demonstrating a level of precision and effectiveness that made resistance seem futile. If the Americans could do this with one squadron attacking one target, what could they not do? The implications were clear to anyone thinking strategically. Germany had lost the war not just militarily but industrially, not just in terms of territory, but in terms of productive capacity. The German railway system, once the envy of Europe and a critical factor in Germany's military successes early in the war, had become a primary target for Allied air power by 1945, and the destruction of Bebra was simply the most dramatic example of a systematic campaign that had been underway for months. Throughout late 1944 and early 1945, Allied tactical and strategic bombers had relentlessly attacked rail infrastructure across Germany. Bridges, tunnels, marshalling yards, repair facilities, locomotives, rolling stock, signal towers, switching stations all became targets for bombers equipped with increasingly sophisticated bomb sights and guided weapons. The strategy was simple and devastatingly effective, elegant in its logic and brutal in its execution. Germany's military machine depended on rails to move everything. Coal for industry travelled by rail, troops moved by rail, tanks and artillery moved by rail, ammunition, fuel, food, all moved by rail. Cut the rails and the machine stopped. Simple as that. The campaign worked because of several converging factors that created perfect conditions for success. Allied air superiority was complete by 1945, allowing bombers to operate with minimal losses. Fighter opposition was negligible. The Germans lacked the resources to repair damage as fast as it was inflicted, creating a cumulative degradation of capability. Their remaining fighters were grounded by fuel shortages that left aircraft sitting uselessly on airfields. Their flak guns were running out of ammunition, reducing defensive effectiveness. Their repair crews were exhausted and demoralized, working without adequate tools or materials. Each successful attack like Bebra made the next attack easier by further degrading German defensive capabilities, creating a downward spiral from which Germany could not recover. The A-26 Invader proved ideal for this campaign, the right aircraft at the right time for the specific missions required. Unlike heavy bombers that needed fighter escort and operated at high altitude, the Invader could attack from medium altitude with accuracy, and could defend itself if intercepted. Unlike fighter bombers carrying limited bomb loads, the Invader could deliver enough ordnance to destroy large targets in a single pass. It was the perfect weapon for the kind of precision destruction that characterized Allied air operations in the war's final months, combining the payload of a bomber with the speed and maneuverability of a fighter. The crew that flew the Bebra mission represented the culmination of American training and doctrine, the end product of years of experience and systematic development. Mitchell, the pilot, had over 400 hours in the A-26 and had studied tactics developed through 3 years of combat experience. Weber, the bombardier, had trained for months on the Norden bomb site and understood the mathematics of ballistics intuitively. Every crew member was a specialist in his position, trained to peacetime standards despite the urgent demands of war. This was possible because American training infrastructure, built during the pre-war period and massively expanded after Pearl Harbor, produced aircrew faster than aircraft could be built to carry them. By 1945, the American training pipeline was graduating thousands of pilots, bombardiers, navigators, and gunners monthly. Each received hundreds of hours of instruction, practiced on training ranges with live ordnance, flew training missions that simulated combat conditions, and arrived at combat units ready to fly immediately. The contrast with German training was stark and illustrated the growing disparity in capabilities. By 1945, Luftwaffe pilots were entering combat with 30 hours of total flight time if they were lucky. They had a minimal gunnery training because ammunition was scarce, almost no formation experience because fuel for training was unavailable, and often flew obsolete aircraft maintained by mechanics who lacked spare parts and worked with improvised tools. The result was predictable and increasingly one-sided. Even when German pilots found opportunities to attack, they lacked the skills to succeed. The few remaining experienced pilots, men with hundreds of missions and years of combat experience, were overwhelmed by numerical superiority and couldn't be everywhere simultaneously. They were being killed off or captured one by one, and there were no replacements with equivalent skills. The industrial factor was equally decisive and perhaps even more important in the long run. The A-26 that Mitchell flew to Berbera was one of over 2,400 invaders produced during the war by Douglas aircraft factories operating 24 hours daily in shifts that never stopped. Each aircraft was built to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, using mass production techniques developed by American industry and refined through years of manufacturing experience. The assembly lines at Douglas facilities in California and Oklahoma represented industrial capacity that Germany simply could not match. Workers, many of them women who had never seen an aircraft before Pearl Harbor, assembled these complex machines with precision that exceeded peacetime standards. The bombs they dropped were produced by the millions in ammunition plants across the United States, facilities built specifically for war production and staffed by workers who understood that their labor directly contributed to victory. The high-octane fuel that powered their engines was refined from crude oil pumped in Texas and Oklahoma, shipped across the Atlantic in tankers that were, themselves products of American mass production, delivered to airfields in France through logistics networks that kept hundreds of squadrons supplied continuously. The entire logistical chain, from raw materials extracted from American soil to combat operations over Germany, was a testament to American industrial capacity and organizational competence. Germany, despite its engineering excellence and early war advantages, could not match this production even at its peak, and by 1945 was nowhere close. German factories were dispersed to avoid bombing, which reduced efficiency. They were bombed anyway, which destroyed equipment and killed skilled workers. They were starved of raw materials as Allied forces cut supply lines and occupied resource-producing regions. They were operated by slave labor of dubious efficiency, workers who had every reason to sabotage production, and often did. By 1945, German aircraft production had collapsed despite desperate attempts to maintain output using underground facilities and dispersed assembly sites. The few aircraft produced were often sabotaged by forced laborers who loosened bolts, damaged components, or introduced defects that would cause failures in flight. Aircraft that made it to operational units were often grounded immediately by lack of fuel, the petroleum refining capacity having been destroyed by strategic bombing. The pilots who should have flown them were increasingly likely to be killed on their first mission, assuming they could even take off. 3 days after the Berbera attack on March 21, 1945, Mitchell and his squadron flew again, this time targeting a bridge over the Rhine that German forces were using to retreat eastward. The war continued, grinding toward its inevitable conclusion with a momentum that seemed unstoppable. But Berbera remained in their memory as the perfect mission, the one where everything worked exactly as planned and the target simply ceased to exist. 50 years of railway development, months of supply accumulation, and hundreds of lives erased in 3 minutes of precise bombing. For the German defenders who survived Berbera's destruction, the attack represented something else entirely beyond military defeat. It was the moment when the full weight of American industrial power became personal and immediate, transforming abstract awareness of Allied superiority into lived experience. They had seen their workplace, their livelihood, their town's economic foundation, erased in minutes by machines they couldn't fight and couldn't stop. 18 aircraft appearing from the dawn sky, dropping their bombs with mechanical precision, and disappearing before effective response was possible. The psychological impact of that helplessness would stay with survivors for the rest of their lives, manifesting as nightmares, anxiety at the sound of aircraft engines, and a permanent sense of vulnerability. Franz Weber, a railway worker who survived by being in a bomb shelter when the attack occurred, described his experience in a 1970 interview with a local historian. "I heard the air raid sirens and went to the shelter as we had been trained. We thought it would be like other raids, a few bombs, some damage, then back to work. When the first bombs hit, the ground shook so violently that we thought the shelter would collapse. Then came the secondary explosions, each one like an earthquake. The shelter lights went out, people were screaming, praying, crying. We thought we would be buried alive. When we finally emerged 3 hours later, the world had ended. Everything was gone. The yard where I had worked for 20 years was just craters and burning wreckage. I saw bodies, parts of bodies. Men I had worked with that morning were just gone, vaporized. I never went back. I couldn't. Even now, 25 years later, I hear aircraft and I want to hide. In the larger context of World War II, the attack on Bebra was a minor footnote in histories focused on major battles and political developments. It didn't make headlines in American newspapers, which were focused on the Rhine crossing and the drive into Germany's heartland. It wasn't commemorated with medals or celebrated in victory parades. The 18 crews who flew the mission received no special recognition beyond the standard mission credit toward their tour completion. To the military bureaucracy, it was simply mission number 347 for the 416th Bomb Group. Successful completion noted in operational records and filed away. But for historians studying the air war over Europe, Bebra represents something significant that deserves more attention than it has received. It demonstrates the evolution of precision bombing from theoretical concept to operational reality, the culmination of years of development in tactics, technology, and training. It illustrates the decisive role of air power in modern warfare, showing how control of the air translates directly into ability to destroy enemy capabilities at will. And it shows how tactical air operations contributed to strategic victory by systematically degrading enemy logistics and accelerating military collapse. The destruction of Bebra also raises moral questions that historians continue to debate and which remain relevant to contemporary military operations. Was it legitimate to destroy a facility that, while primarily military in function, also supported civilian economic activity and employed civilian workers? Were the civilian casualties, railway workers who happened to be at work that morning, acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of military objectives? Did the principle of proportionality apply, weighing military advantage gained against civilian harm inflicted? These questions don't have simple answers, and thoughtful people can disagree about the ethical calculus involved. The crews who flew the mission believed they were attacking a legitimate military target under the laws of war, as understood in 1945. The intelligence briefing had emphasized the military nature of the facility, documenting its use for military supply distribution and troop transportation. The attack was executed during early morning hours specifically to minimize civilian presence in the town, though the military nature of the target meant that workers and soldiers at the facility itself were necessarily at risk. The bombing was as precise as 1945 technology allowed, with bombardiers aiming for specific military structures rather than area targets, attempting to minimize damage to the surrounding town. The use of precision bombing rather than area incendiary attacks reflected an attempt to distinguish between military and civilian targets, even while recognizing that the distinction was imperfect. Yet the human cost was real and cannot be dismissed with appeals to military necessity. 127 railway workers died, men who were civilians under international law, even though they supported military logistics. These were fathers, husbands, brothers, sons, each an individual with family, dreams, and inherent worth. Their families suffered losses as profound as any military casualties, grief that didn't end when the war ended. The town of Bebra was economically devastated, losing its primary employer and facing a future of poverty and difficult reconstruction. Widows struggled to support children alone. Orphans grew up without fathers. The social fabric of the community was torn and took decades to repair. These costs must be weighed against the military necessity of destroying facilities that supported German military operations and prolonged a war of aggression that Germany had started and sustained through years of conquest and occupation. The post-war fate of Bebra itself is instructive for understanding the long-term consequences of strategic bombing. The town fell to American forces on April 2, 1945, just 2 weeks after the bombing, captured by advancing units who found it devastated not just by the attack, but by years of war. The marshalling yard remained unusable for months, the twisted rails and destroyed rolling stock preventing any traffic. American military government authorities eventually provided resources for reconstruction, as part of the broader effort to rebuild German infrastructure, recognizing that a functioning rail system was necessary for occupation logistics and eventual economic recovery. But the facility never regained its pre-war importance. Superseded by other junctions and changed traffic patterns, the German railway system was reorganized in the post-war period under Allied occupation, with routes and facilities rationalized for peacetime efficiency, and Bebra became a secondary junction rather than a major hub. Today the town has about 14,000 residents, 3 times its 1945 population, having grown slowly through post-war decades. The railway facility, while functional and still an important employer, operates on a much smaller scale than in 1945 and employs only a fraction of its wartime workforce. Modern freight patterns and container shipping have reduced the need for the kind of marshalling yard operations that made Bebra important in 1945. The story of the Bebra attack has been largely forgotten, except by local historians who maintain memories of the town's wartime experience and military aviation enthusiasts who study tactical bombing operations. Unlike famous raids like Schweinfurt or Ploiesti, which have been chronicled in books and documentary films, Bebra doesn't appear in popular histories of the air war. The squadron records were filed away in National Archives boxes, the reconnaissance photos stored alongside thousands of similar images documenting the systematic destruction of German infrastructure. The veterans who flew the mission returned home after the war ended, resumed civilian lives, and rarely spoke about their wartime experiences. This silence was common among veterans who had seen combat and returned to find civilian society uninterested in or unable to comprehend what they had experienced. Captain James Mitchell, the mission leader, became a commercial airline pilot after the war and flew for 30 years without ever publicly discussing his combat record. He died in 1987, and his obituary made no mention of his wartime service. Lieutenant Thomas Weber, the bombardier whose aim had been so deadly accurate, became a high school mathematics teacher in Ohio and occasionally used bombing ballistics as an example when teaching physics principles, but never discussed the human cost of his precision. Most of the other crew members similarly returned to quiet civilian lives, becoming businessmen, teachers, farmers, factory workers, indistinguishable from millions of other veterans. A few gave interviews to historians in later years when interest in World War II history increased, but even then they spoke more about their aircraft and their squadrons than about specific missions. The trauma of combat, the memories of destruction inflicted and danger survived, remained private matters discussed rarely even with family members, yet the mission remained significant as an example of what air power had become by 1945, the culmination of decades of aviation development and years of wartime experience. The ability to destroy a major facility with a single squadron attack, executed with minimal losses and near-perfect accuracy, represented a quantum leap in military capability compared to even 5 years earlier. It demonstrated that the decades of aviation development, the massive investments in training and equipment, the integration of technology and tactics, and the organizational competence of American military forces had produced a capability capable of unprecedented precision and destruction. The weapons technology that made Bebra possible continued evolving after the war, advancing rapidly through the Cold War and beyond. The Norden bomb site, cutting edge in 1945, was superseded by radar, bombing systems that could operate through clouds and at night, eliminating the weather dependency that limited 1945 operations. The high explosive bombs that required visual delivery and mechanical fuses were replaced by guided weapons with electronic fuses and precision guidance. The bomb loads that required 18 aircraft in 1945 could be delivered by a single aircraft by the 1960s as payload capacities increased. The accuracy that was measured in hundreds of feet in 1945 would be measured in meters by the 1970s and eventually in feet with GPS-guided weapons. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged across decades of technological evolution. Air power could deliver precise destructive force against specific targets with efficiency that ground forces couldn't match, changing the calculus of warfare and making certain types of targets effectively indefensible. The attack on Bebra demonstrated this principle with clarity that influenced air power doctrine for generations, becoming a case study in precision attack and logistics interdiction, even if it was never famous. For the citizens of Bebra who lived through that March morning in 1945, the experience remained seared in memory, for those who survived and became part of community memory, passed to subsequent generations. The sound of air raid sirens at dawn, piercing the early morning quiet and sending people running for shelters, the deep rumble of approaching aircraft, 36 engines creating a sound like continuous thunder, the whistle of falling bombs, a sound that started as a distant shriek and rose to unbearable intensity. And then the explosions that seemed to go on forever, each one a physical blow felt through the ground and in the chest. The ground shaking, buildings swaying, windows shattering throughout the town, and the sky turning black with smoke that blotted out the sun. Then the secondary explosions as ammunition cooked off, each one a thunderclap that rattled teeth and stopped hearts, continuing intermittently for hours as different stockpiles reached ignition temperature. The fire that burned for 3 days, visible from miles away, a beacon of destruction that drew people from surrounding towns to stare in horror at the column of smoke. The desperate attempts to fight the fires and save what could be saved, attempts that proved futile against the scale of destruction, and the continuing explosions of delayed action bombs. The search for survivors, calling out names and listening for responses, digging through rubble with bare hands. The recovery of bodies, the improvised morgues in churches and schools where the dead were laid out for identification. The funerals that went on for weeks as victims were identified and buried in mass graves because individual plots were impossible. The widows and orphans who faced uncertain futures in a collapsing Reich that had no resources to support them. All of this followed from 3 minutes of bombing by a single squadron executing orders from commanders who would never see the results personally and who moved on to planning the next mission. The moral weight of this disconnect between those who order attacks and those who suffer them remains a central question in warfare ethics that has not been resolved despite decades of discussion. The crews who flew to Bebra that morning were not monsters or war criminals by any reasonable definition. They were young Americans doing their duty as they understood it, following lawful orders, executing their training and trying to survive long enough to go home to families and futures. They believed they were attacking military targets in service of ending a war started by German aggression and sustained by German military operations. From their perspective, every successful mission brought victory closer and potentially saved lives by hastening German surrender and ending a war that was killing thousands daily. These perspectives are not easily reconciled with the experience of those who suffered the attack, and perhaps they shouldn't be. The reality of strategic bombing in World War II was that it involved deliberate destruction of infrastructure and accepted civilian casualties as inevitable consequences of military necessity. Whether this was justified depends on one's moral framework, assessment of proportionality, and judgment about alternative courses of action. What remains indisputable is that attacks like Bebra were highly effective in military terms, contributing substantially to Allied victory by systematically degrading German capabilities. In the final accounting, the attack on Bebra marshalling yard by a single squadron of A-26 invaders on March 18, 1945 represents war at its most efficient and most terrible, the intersection of industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and human cost. 18 aircraft, 72 crew members, 720 bombs, 3 minutes of combat, and a critical facility removed from German order of battle permanently. The mathematics was simple and could be calculated on paper. The human cost was complicated and continues to resonate decades later. The strategic result was decisive, accelerating German defeat by days or weeks. This was how wars were won in 1945, not through heroic charges or climactic battles, but through systematic destruction of enemy capabilities by forces enjoying overwhelming material superiority. The German defenders at Bebra could not prevent the attack because they lacked the aircraft, fuel, pilots, and equipment to contest American air superiority. The years of war had ground down German defences to the point where they could only watch as their world exploded around them and hope to survive. The flak guns fired until they ran out of ammunition or their crews were killed. The fighters that might have intercepted the bombers sat on distant airfields without fuel. The repair capacity that might have restored the facility after the attack didn't exist because German industry was collapsing. The American crews could execute the attack with confidence because they flew superior aircraft maintained by skilled mechanics with unlimited spare parts, had excellent training provided by a system that could afford to train pilots for hundreds of hours enjoyed complete intelligence about the target from reconnaissance that German fighters couldn't stop, and faced minimal opposition from an enemy that had been systematically ground down. They could focus on accuracy and effectiveness rather than survival, confident that their aircraft could absorb defensive fire and that losses would be minimal. This asymmetry, more than any single battle or campaign, explains the outcome of World War II in Europe in its final phase. By March 1945, Germany retained brave soldiers who continued fighting with determination, capable equipment that was often superior to Allied equivalents in specific characteristics, and defensive positions that could still inflict casualties on attackers. What Germany lacked was the industrial capacity to replace losses that occurred daily, the fuel to move forces and power aircraft, the ammunition to sustain combat, and the logistical infrastructure to support operations. Each successful attack on facilities like Bebra accelerated the collapse of this infrastructure and brought final defeat measurably closer, tightening the noose around remaining German forces. The attack also demonstrated that precision was now possible in tactical bombing, in ways that had not been possible earlier in the war. Earlier in the war, bombing accuracy was measured in miles, with even focused attacks achieving circular errors of thousands of feet. Attacks on railways required hundreds of bombers dropping thousands of tons to ensure destruction, accepting that most bombs would miss the target. By 1945, a single well-trained squadron with good intelligence and proper equipment could destroy specific targets with minimal expenditure, representing both technological advance and accumulated experience. This evolution made air power more effective militarily, and paradoxically potentially more humane, by reducing the need for area bombing and mass attacks on cities. The Bebra mission stands as an example of this new precision, even as it reminds us that precision in targeting does not eliminate human suffering, and may in some ways make it more acute. The railway workers who died were killed precisely because the bombing was accurate, hitting exactly the facility where they worked rather than missing and hitting the town. Their deaths were not accidents or unintended collateral damage in the traditional sense, but direct results of successful targeting of a facility they operated. This raises uncomfortable questions about the distinction between military and civilian targets in modern war, questions that remain relevant as precision weapons become more capable. When Captain Mitchell landed back at base that morning, his primary emotion was relief at having survived another mission in a war that could still kill him at any moment. He had executed his orders professionally, led his formation safely to target and back, and achieved mission objectives completely. In his mind and the minds of his crew, this was a good day, a successful mission that brought them one step closer to completing their tours and going home. That evening he wrote a letter to his wife in Pennsylvania, describing the mission in vague terms allowed by censorship, mentioning only that the target was destroyed and everyone returned safely. He didn't mention the explosions or fires or the column of smoke that rose miles into the sky, or the secondary explosions that continued for hours. These details would have worried her needlessly and served no purpose. He focused instead on mundane details, the food in the mess hall, the poker game that evening, his hope that the war would end soon so he could come home. Meanwhile, in Bebra, survivors were digging through rubble searching for bodies as fires still burned and occasional explosions still erupted. The human experiences that day, occurring simultaneously but in radically different contexts, could hardly have been more different. This disconnect between the experience of attacking and being attacked is fundamental to modern warfare and becomes more pronounced as technological advantages increase. Air power creates physical and psychological distance between combatants, allowing one side to inflict destruction while remaining essentially invulnerable to retaliation. This asymmetry, while militarily decisive, raises questions about the nature of combat and the moral responsibilities of those who possess such overwhelming advantages. These questions remain relevant today, as precision strike capabilities have advanced far beyond what was possible in 1945, and the ethical frameworks developed to govern warfare must continually adapt to new technological realities. The lessons of missions like Bebra remain instructive for contemporary military planners and ethicists wrestling with these issues. The story of the day a single Allied bomber squadron destroyed an entire German train depot is ultimately a story about power, technology, training, and the terrible efficiency of modern war when one side achieves overwhelming superiority. It demonstrates what becomes possible when industrial capacity, technical innovation, and professional military competence converge in pursuit of strategic objectives. It reminds us that efficiency in warfare, while tactically admirable and strategically necessary, carries human costs that transcend military calculations and continue to resonate long after bombs stop falling. And it stands as historical evidence that by March 1945, the outcome of World War II in Europe was no longer in doubt because one side possessed capabilities the other could not match or counter, capabilities demonstrated with devastating clarity in 3 minutes over a railway yard that few had heard of before it ceased to exist.